Netanyahu. And although Mr. Netanyahu is not a novice to the position, this new tenure brings with it new challenges and new opportunities. In the former category, there is the emboldened Iranian regime due to this administration's policy of pursuing negotiations over a nuclear deal with it, as well as waves of Palestinian terrorist attacks across Israel's cities, something that miraculously Israel has not experienced in years. Among the opportunities, of course, is a new Middle East, brokered by the Abraham Accords agreement, of which Mr. Netanyahu was one of the architects. Joining us today to discuss are two distinguished panelists. The first is Caroline Glick. Caroline Glick is the senior contributing editor at Jewish News Syndicate, where she writes columns and hosts the Caroline Glick Show podcast. She is also the diplomatic commentator for Israel's Channel 14 television and a columnist at Newsweek. She was previously a senior columnist of the Jerusalem Post and Israel Hayom. She is also a former assistant foreign policy advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu and a veteran of the Israel Defense Forces. Glick is the author of Shackled Warrior and the Israeli Solution, as well as How Bibi Got His Mandate and What to Do with It. You may watch Caroline's weekly web TV show on Israeli politics and security issues on her website, carolineglick.com. Caroline may join us momentarily. Our second guest, Daniel Pollak, is the Director of Government Relations for the Zionist Organization of America, ZOA. He has been with the ZOA, the oldest pro-Israel organization in the United States, since 2007. Daniel educates members of Congress, their staff, and other government officials on the relationship between the United States and Israel and on policy issues relating to the Middle East. Mr. Pollak served as a submarine officer in the United States Navy and then pursued a 25-year career in the information technology industry. Welcome, Daniel. Welcome to you both. Just a note on how today's program will run. We will speak with Dan and when Caroline joins us, with Caroline as well, for the next 30 minutes or so, where I'll ask them a series of questions before turning to your questions, the viewers. If you do have questions, please type them into the Facebook live chat and no later than 1:30, after which point we will stop taking questions. So with that, welcome, Dan, again, and let me open with a question about your reflections on, it's been just over a month since the election. Bibi is still building his coalition. I understand he just got an extension for another 10 days. He requested 2 weeks. Tell us a bit about what your impressions are of his efforts, as well as what the U.S. response has been.
Well, thanks so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. I know the American First Policy Institute has been very active, and I'm really excited to be part of this presentation. So in Israel, every government since their founding has been a coalition government, and this one is no different. The way they do parties, they have proportional representation, and it's very, very messy. It's not a surprise that it's taken longer to form the government than some people expected. The basic idea, the four parties in the ruling coalition have a total of 64 seats out of the 120 in the Israeli Knesset, or parliament. But the actual details of who gets which job is the subject of endless negotiation. The framework for the negotiations are fully in place now, but the details of who's going to have exactly what portfolio and for how long are still being worked out. And there are a couple of officials, for example, who have been convicted of white-collar offenses, and the Knesset has to give them immunity in order to allow them to serve in the government. And some of those details are still being worked out. But my sources in Israel tell me that things are basically on track. It would be a great surprise if they don't have the government formed in the next few days. And it seems to be on track. The big picture, though, a lot of what I deal with is about the American reaction. And the American reaction has been really troubling in some ways. Israel's a democracy. As you said, they've had 5 elections in 4 years, maybe a bit too much of a democracy even. But each of those elections has resulted in roughly similar results. That's one of the things that's surprising. This time, it was decisive for the right-wing coalition, but the other elections, for tactical reasons, resulted in some small parties throwing the election into not able to form a coalition that could support Netanyahu. There are a number of centrist and right-wing parties who are in agreement on the issues about Arab-Israeli peace and response to Iran and so on, but who have a personality conflict with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and they refuse to support him. This time, a couple of those parties didn't make the threshold for votes. There's a minimum vote, and that's what resulted in the change. But there is reasons for movement to the right. Israel of today is very different from the one from a generation ago, which was roughly split between the Labour Party and the Likud. Now there's no question that the majority, as I said, 64 out of 120 seats, is in the nationalistic or right-wing camp. What's troubling to us as Americans is the reaction of certain politicians to the inclusion of certain individuals in the Israeli government. There are two people, one named Smotrich and the other Ben Gvir, who are routinely labeled as extreme right-wingers in the American media. And these people ended up with 14 votes. They'll be the second largest party other than the Likud in the coalition. And some are arguing in the United States Congress, in particular Senator Menendez of New Jersey and Brad Sherman of California in the House. Both of them are pro-Israel for the Democratic Party, but are saying that the relationship between the United States and Israel will have to change if these so-called extremists are given cabinet positions in the Israeli government. And the Biden administration has said that they may not interact with certain members of the Israeli government because of their extremism. This is wholly unprecedented. It's absurd when you think about it. It's a democratic election, and the Israeli people have to be the ones to choose their leaders. Just try to do as a thought experiment the idea that the United States would not interact with for example, a minister of internal policing in Iceland or in France because of disagreements on some history. But it is happening right now. It's becoming a problem. The administration has been careful about what they're saying, but they have off the record let it be known there will be consequences to the American-Israel relationship. It even went so far as a column by former ambassador to Israel, David Kurtzer, and Daniel Kurtzer, and former Bush State Department official Aaron David Miller, saying that they would advocate the cutting of aid to Israel preemptively. And I see that Caroline has joined us, so I wanted to give her a chance to respond to the question now. Caroline wrote an excellent column on this and other things, but I wanted to give her a chance to answer the first question.
Welcome, Caroline.
Hi, thanks so much. Can you just can we just first of all, I'm sorry, I got a little bit confused about the time difference. I'm thinking Central Time because I'm from Chicago, so I thought that 1 o'clock was 9 o'clock here. So I apologize for that.
No.
Can you just repeat what the first question was?
Absolutely, and this New Yorker won't hold that against you, the Central Time, Eastern Time. So welcome again, Caroline. We were just talking about the U.S. response to the election in Israel. And Dan was describing how really unprecedented it has been, how lukewarm and really icy the administration has been towards the coalition that's being formed and some of the so-called right-wing members of the coalition. And
yeah,
I'll just say anecdotally. Sorry.
No, I think that it's true what Dan was saying, that we have seen unprecedented hostility, but we have to remember that the Biden administration overall is extremely hostile to Israel. It's not specifically to Israel's right wing, because when we had the outgoing government at the height of its power, it was really being brought low by the Biden administration on a whole host of issues. The Biden administration announced that the FBI is investigating IDF soldiers for the death of an Al Jazeera journalist named Shireen Abu Akleh, who is apparently also an American citizen. Abu Akleh was embedded with terrorists from the Iranian-controlled Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorist groups while they were engaged in a firefight with IDF forces. So not only by the laws of war, but also by U.S. law, she was a legitimate target for attack as somebody who was with terrorists in the middle of a battle against Israeli soldiers. It's not at all clear how she was killed, but regardless of how she was killed, this is certainly not an issue for the FBI to be investigating. And the fact that the FBI decided to open this investigation either with or without the support and at the urging of the White House, where the State Department is really immaterial. The fact is that they were doing this while supposedly sympathetic Israeli government was in power, shows that the hostility that the Biden administration is exhibiting towards Benjamin Netanyahu and his incoming coalition is not or merely because they're on the political right, but rather because they're Israeli. I mean, I think that the overall policy of this administration is to be hostile towards Israel. They upgraded American ties with the Palestinian Authority by promoting what's his name? The guy who's the head of the Assistant Deputy Secretary of State for Israel and Palestinian Affairs to be the U.S. Hadi Amar, exactly, to be the envoy to the Palestinians from the administration. So this is an upgraded position that he was just promoted to upgrade U.S. ties with the Palestinians. This again was done under the outgoing government. So too, under the outgoing government, the Biden administration essentially coerced Israel into agreeing to a maritime agreement with Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon, in which Israel ceded both parts of its territorial waters and its economic waters, including vast natural gas reserves, to Lebanon in a disputed claim, with the full knowledge that all the money that Lebanon may or may not get from the gas field in question is going to be under the control of Hezbollah. And so this, again, was something that the Biden administration did under an Israeli administration that is supportive of the Biden administration. So the Biden administration is hostile to Israel, and now they're using the right wing's rise to power in the November 1st elections as an additional excuse and justification for expanding and escalating their open hostility towards Israel, I think is really the way that you have to look at it.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent observation. And, I think I take it to heart. I think that this administration is just overtly, as you say, hostile towards Israel, full stop. I mean, I just the week of the election, I saw that Blinken congratulated Lula and then the Iraqi prime minister, and only congratulated Lapid for conceding the election, but said nothing about Netanyahu or anything that was happening there. And so I think that's a really well taken point. That said, they have sent a specific message on what kind of Israel policy they, as you suggested with the promotion of Hadi Amar, that they would be upholding. Most recently, Secretary of State Blinken delivered a speech at J Street. I don't know if it was at the speech or on the margins of it, whose leadership said that they're on high alert over the outcome of the Israeli elections. I wonder if both of you might say a few words about that speech, about the significance for our viewers of appearing as a keynote at a J Street function. I don't know if he will planning on addressing the APAC one as well, but just on that point. Maybe Caroline, starting with you.
Okay, so I think it's here important to note that J Street was a controversial organization when it was established, with seed money provided to the organization by George Soros. It's an organization that is funded by a whole sort of laundry list of radical left and Arab organizations and individuals. It proclaims itself pro-Israel and pro-peace, but over, I think, the decade or so that it's been in existence, it began actually sort of as a as an adjunct to the Obama presidential campaign in 2008, and it served sort of as an adjunct to the administration during both of Obama's terms in office, in the sense that it served as a fig leaf Jewish organization that was supportive of Obama's anti-Israel policies, both vis-a-vis the Palestinians and vis-a-vis Iran. In fact, I can't think, maybe Dan can, of an instance where J Street supported Israel in anything against either the Palestinians or against Iran. So the fact that they call themselves a pro-Israel organization does not mean that they are in fact a pro-Israel organization. In fact, to the contrary, they're an anti-Israel organization. And from the outset, there was a question about how willing Democrats were, not to mention Republicans, but certainly Democrats were, to be openly associated with J Street. And initially, there was a reluctance on the part of Democrats to be associated with the organization. But as Obama worked pretty openly to weaken and undermine the credibility of AIPAC, I think most notably by pushing AIPAC out to lobby for U.S. airstrikes against Syria when they really didn't care one way or another. And it was a means to blame Obama's red line to attack Assad in the event that he used chemical weapons against his opponents in the Syrian civil war. He tried to blame it on the Jews, even though AIPAC had nothing to do whatsoever with that entire undertaking, and then spying on AIPAC lobbyists during the fight over the Iran nuclear deal from 2014 and 2015, which was sort of a dress rehearsal for the eavesdropping that the Obama administration, and later the FBI under the Trump administration, took during the 2016 elections against Trump campaign staff and advisors. So Obama was undermining AIPAC throughout his tenure in office, and over time began more and more empowering J Street as a mouthpiece. J Street opened up a 501c4 organization to fund Democrats. They started doing it. In districts where it was pretty clear that the Democrats were going to win, in order to build up their chits as an influential organization by going on sure bets, and then and they opened up fronts against two Republican congressmen that were opposed openly to the establishment of a Palestinian state, Alan West and Joel Walsh. And then they moved on, and they've become a very powerful organization for giving a sort of kosher, good housekeeping seal of approval to anti-Israel Democrats who can say that they're backed by J Street, as if that means that when an anti-Israel organization ostensibly run by American Jews supports you, that means that you're pro-Israel because you get their support. And so that's what J Street is. And the fact that the Secretary of State now felt comfortable being the keynote speaker at their convention means that, as far as the Democrats today are concerned, J Street is a completely it is an adjunct of their policies, and they're no longer worried about what people will think, because they have successfully weakened AIPAC, and they have successfully lowered the support that Israel receives from the Democratic Party, to the extent that Tony Blinken can go there. And now specifically to what he said there, he said, I think the main thing that he said that was distressing was in relation to the administration's continued refusal to back the revolutionaries in Iran, and its continued support for the regime and desire to reach a nuclear deal with the regime that wouldn't block Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, but as its predecessor, the JCPOA that Obama signed into or agreed to in 2015, will give Iran the international legitimacy from the UN Security Council to develop a nuclear arsenal, and will also provide Iran with around $275 billion in sanctions relief over the next 12 months and $1 trillion in sanctions relief by 2013, thus giving a lifeline to the regime. And he said that they were continuing to maintain their hope to sign such a deal with Iran, even as the regime is executing its young women and men in the streets and by a hangman's noose in the streets of Iran. So that was the most disappointing thing. And in relation to the Palestinians, again, they use J Street as a means to justify throwing Israel to the jackals in relation to the PA, in relation to the Palestinians that are openly seeking Israel's destruction and the demonization and delegitimization of Israel's very existence.
Yeah. No, that's
that. First, no, I don't know of any pro-Israel activities J Street has ever been engaged in. At our website, zoa.org, we have a white paper kind of chronicling thing after thing where they've been opposed to the interests of both Israel and the United States, frankly. If you're the America First Policy Institute, they may very well be the America Last, actually. But the real illustration for people who don't know much about J Street is one can argue about various peace process things and be on either side of it and still love Israel. But J Street takes Iran's side in regard to the nuclear deal. They want the United States to resume the Iran deal, even though it would definitely lead to the establishment of an Iranian nuclear capability that would threaten both Israel and the United States. So J Street is a disaster. For the speech that Secretary of State Blinken gave there, the most outrageous thing is he treated it as though Israel and the Palestinian Authority were equal partners of the United States, and nothing could be further from the truth. The Palestinian Authority has been rewarded time after time, even though it has done nothing that is in America's interest. Every policy step they take, and of course, as everyone should know, they haven't had a free and fair election. We still call Abbas President Abbas, but his term ran out over 11 years ago, and he's still recognized as president. When it comes to the so-called two-state solution, that's also what Blinken spoke about. This is a completely unworkable fantasy at this point. Caroline has an excellent book speaking about the other opportunities for a solution that people could imagine, and I recommended the book to everyone. But one of them is not a so-called two-state solution. The establishment of a Palestinian Arab state would be a disaster for the region and even for the Palestinian Arab peoples. But it would be a real disaster for the United States and those of us who care about the United States. When it comes to Iran, the most outrageous thing, again, as Caroline said, is even to the degree that they're not moving forward with returning to the JCPOA, the rationale has more to do with Iran supplying weapons to Russia for the war in Ukraine than it does about America's interests. This is where the America First agenda needs to be enunciated, which is it's not good for America or for Israel for Iran to move forward to a nuclear status. There are other countries in the region, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, all of whom may be pursuing nuclear weapons if Iran is moving towards it. And the idea of non-proliferation is effectively dead. It's terrible for American foreign policy. And it is somewhat insulting that when they chant death to America, when they kill their own people, that isn't a rationale for stopping nuclear talks, but only when they are assisting our enemy, Russia. It's ironic. So
Absolutely.
We are completely unsatisfied with Blinken's policies and that enunciated at that speech.
No, that's a great point and a great segue as well to my next question. For a reminder to viewers, if you do have a question, please type it into the Facebook Live chat function. We will be taking questions for another 10 minutes or so, at which point we'll turn to the questions. If both of you briefly could remark on Netanyahu's return in the context of a new Middle East. Of course, Netanyahu being one of the architects of the Abraham Accords. We both mentioned the specific and explicit U.S. policy towards the Middle East, and maybe here also to mention something about Congress as well, especially with the Abraham Accords caucus. So maybe starting with Caroline and then moving over to Dan.
Thank you. I think that first of all, just to follow up on what Dan was saying about America First. I mean, I think that the Abraham Accords are an expression of the America First foreign policy doctrine that the Trump administration advanced in such a revolutionary way. It was revolutionary because, as I wrote in my book, The Israeli Solution, the two-state solution is a chimera that captivated both the Republicans and the Democrats. And it was an idea that, it was some sort of deus ex machina that's going to come down and solve all the problems in the Middle East. But really all it did was obfuscate the realities of the Middle East from the eyes for U.S. policymakers and elected leaders, that really Israel and the Palestinians is a minor problem in the Middle East, and there are far greater pathologies. The first most important one today is the Islamic Republic of Iran and its quest for nuclear weapons, but there are many others. And by focusing on Israel and the Palestinians and then placing all the blame on Israel for the absence of peace in the Middle East, by saying that this was the one thing that was blocking peace in the Middle East overall, and this made it so that the United States was effectively removing the possibility that its and most loyal ally in the Middle East would actually be able to emerge as a regional power by putting it in the doghouse perpetually over this massively exaggerated issue. It made it very difficult as a practical matter for Israel and the Arabs to work together against Iran or to really live at peace, because the Americans were effectively siding with the Palestinians against the nations of the region, saying the Palestinians are more important than you are. And Israel has to bow to the Palestinians and kiss Yasser Arafat's ring and give up Jerusalem before you guys are allowed to have peace with Israel. And when you did that, you sort of left the region in this unstable situation perpetually that bogged America down as the region's sole policeman and prevented the nations of the region from acting either separately or together against common threats. So that started to end and crumble under the Obama administration with the rise of Iran and the existential threat posed by the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, with the support of the Obama administration on traditional Arab Sunni regimes, first and foremost the Saudis and Egypt, which fell to the Muslim Brotherhood with the support of the Obama administration in 2013. And then the Muslim Brotherhood regime was overthrown with the support of Saudi Arabia and Israel in 2014. Or 2012 and 2013, whatever. So the point is that America, the idea of America First for Trump was that the way for the United States to be able to extricate itself from the wars of the Middle East was by standing with America's allies and enabling them, giving them the political support, the military support in terms of weapons systems and other things, intelligence cooperation, logistical support from the U.S., so that they would be able to take care of the threats that they shared with the United States without active American involvement. So the Abraham Accord was born of desperation by Israel and the Sunnis over America's stance with Iran and with the Muslim Brotherhood against them. And beginning in 2013, 2014, you started to see this very surprising situation where Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain and Egypt were standing with Israel against Hamas. And Hamas, on the other hand, was being supported by Qatar, Turkey, and the Obama administration. So the Trump administration saw this new alliance. Netanyahu obviously discussed it with Trump and with his team when they came into office. And he decided that the best way to rebuild American credibility and also to enable the United States to disengage from active involvement in the wars of the Middle East was by sort of taking over this working alliance that had been built from 2013 on between Israel and the Sunni Arab states, and doing so not by squelching that cooperation, but by expanding it and giving a lot of American support for it. Part of that was with Israel being moved from being the area of responsibility of America's Eurocom and moving Israel to Central Command, which is responsible for the Arab world and the Muslim world. So that Israel was moved to its region also under the American military umbrella of CENTCOM, and that was also important. So when you look at what the Abraham Accords was about, it was about giving America's allies the ability to fight their own battles, to fight them together, to fight them separately, and then as U.S. allies, they were effectively also protecting America's interests in the Middle East and enabling the United States to walk away. Now the Biden administration is trying to undermine the Abraham Accords by what my friend and colleague Tony Bedran has written about in Tablet Magazine, and he's described as they're trying to essentially say that they want Israel to be integrated into the region. And when they talk about integration, they're not talking about alliance building against U.S. foes, first and foremost Iran, but others as well. But rather that they want to empty the Abraham Accords of all meaning by bringing in the Palestinians, by bringing in Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon, and Qatar, which is the capital of the Muslim Brotherhood and Iran's closest ally in the Arab world. So by trying to integrate three enemies of this alliance, the Palestinians, the Lebanese, and the Qataris, into the Abraham Accords, the administration is trying to undermine the accords and reinstate the Palestinian veto over Israel-Arab peace. And what we can expect from Netanyahu when he comes into office is that he will work very closely with the Saudis, who are not an official member of the Abraham Accords, but without their support, there never would have been any Abraham Accords, to either formally normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, or at a minimum to block the Americans from succeeding in their efforts to bring in Qatar and Lebanon, and as well as the Palestinians into the accords. I think that you see the UAE is not interested in that either. The UAE and Israel just signed a free trade agreement or some such thing, and trade has expanded hundreds of times over the past 12 months. So I think that we're going to see a much more intimate relationship on a strategic level between Israel and its Abraham Accords partners and Saudi Arabia, and sort of a blocking action against what the administration has been moving forward towards achieving under the outgoing, much more pliant Israeli government that's now leaving office.
What I would add to that very quickly is, first of all, as Caroline has written, the best thing about the Abraham Accords was that we got Sunni Arab countries to explicitly state that progress with the Palestinian Arabs was not a prerequisite for normalization and peace with Israel. And the administration is trying to work to reinstate, as she said, the Palestinian Arab veto of any progress. It's just there ought to be a penalty for diplomatic malpractice. What the administration has done with Saudi Arabia has pushed them into the arms of China. There are consequences when you do this. Now, I'm not a romantic on Saudi Arabia. They're doing what's in their best interest, but they have right now a common interest with Israel, and it should be with the United States, to counter Iranian influence. And the way that things work in this region of the world, when you do something that undercuts the power of your own side, an Arab government like Saudi Arabia is going to seek to almost an insurance policy. And they are trying to get closer to China, even to Russia. And they just are having all kinds of negative consequences for the American-Saudi relationship. I don't think Saudi Arabia will actually formally enter the Abraham Accords until the old king passes away. But Israel and Saudi Arabia have a real common interest at fighting Iran. There's some concern that Iran may reach out and destroy some refinery facilities in Saudi Arabia again in the near term. That's a surprise that could happen because the United States has made it clear that we are not committed to the defense of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the way that we were under the Trump administration. So it's fundamental bad. For the first few months of the Biden administration, they wouldn't even use the words Abraham Accords. At least they pay lip service to it now, but they're trying to redefine what it means. And that's something that we should all cast light upon. And it's really diplomatic malpractice.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's probably the record of diplomatic malpractice cannot be overstated and is probably longer than we have time to discuss on the program. But no doubt, I think this administration is probably focused singularly on this increasingly dangerous Iran deal and elevating the Palestinian Arab veto, as Caroline described, over real progress and peace that words ushered in. And so it's quite actually strange to see Israel and peace-loving neighbors against the United States and kind of pushing back on this pressure. Mario asks exactly this question: will a Netanyahu right-center administration be able to stand against pressures from the Biden administration on a two-state solution with the division of Jerusalem? Maybe first to Caroline and then to Dan.
Well, the short answer is yes, but there's really no way of, and that's for two reasons. One is because, we saw Netanyahu was able to withstand that pressure from Obama at the time, and he's more powerful politically now than he was with Obama. And the other reason is because there's just no way of getting there. And there's the Palestinian Authority is just a criminal syndicate that's based on graft and monopoly power over and the ability to give out favors and pay off various terrorists and things like that. It's not a real government; it's a kleptocracy, and it's just a terror machine that siphons off billions of dollars to pay for terrorists and to line the pockets of whoever needs to have their pockets lined at any particular moment. And that's really what the Palestinian Authority is. So there's no way that you're going to reach any sort of a diplomatic deal with them, because that would undermine the whole rationale for its existence, so long as it exists, until people get tired of it and move on. But those are the two reasons. But I think one of the things that we're finding that's most distressing, and we're seeing it now with the operation of the outgoing government that's soon to be the opposition here in Israel, and also that you're seeing with some of the things that Dan was talking about when I came here a little bit late. Sorry about that again. In terms of the way that this government is being denounced and criminalized and delegitimized before it's even sworn into office. Here in Israel, we're having it undertaken by our deep state, along with the outgoing government. You have 5 former chiefs of staff of the IDF that are calling for civil unrest and civil war against this government and saying that it's illegitimate. And even if it was democratically elected, it stands for things that are antithetical to the nature of Israel. All of these things are lies. You can read about, and in my latest article on jns.org, you can look at that, or on my website, carolineglick.com. But we're seeing something that's very similar to what the Democrats and the establishment, the bureaucratic establishment and the media did to the Trump administration during its 4 years in power and since then, in terms of trying to delegitimize them and demonize them. The sort of adjunct to that is the rising anti-Semitism on the progressive left in the United States that denies Jews their right to be pro-Israel on college campuses. and in the workplace. So you're seeing a lot of that in Israel as well. And I think that the idea is to it's not about peace. It was never really about peace. Dan was talking about the Dan Kurtzer, Aaron David Miller Washington Post op-ed that was put out the week before last, where they said that it's true the peace process is dead in the water. There's no way to get peace. Moribund, I think was their term. So they were clear that they didn't really care about that. They just went for pure demonization as a justification for open hostility towards Israel on the part of the Biden administration and adopting an openly anti-Israel policy list, including partial arms embargo against Israel of offensive weapon systems, throwing Israel to the jackals at the UN and the International Criminal Court at The Hague, and then undermining the Abraham Accords to punish the Arab states who made peace with Israel without first worrying about the Palestinians. So I think that what we're seeing now is not going to be a push so much for Israel to give up territory to the Palestinians. It is a full court effort by the Biden administration, even in the absence of a fig leaf of a peace process, to adopt policies that are simply hateful towards Israel, because people in the Biden administration, unfortunately, that are in positions in relation to the U.S. policy towards Israel, are very hostile to Israel.
And just to add, the answer is no. I agree that Prime Minister Netanyahu will not give in to that pressure. It's existential for Israel. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has written a book himself about how a Palestinian Arab state is not consistent with Israel's actual survival. I mean, the place where they want to have a state, a person with a shoulder-launched surface-to-air missile could shoot down incoming airliners to Ben Gurion Airport. So that's probably not going to happen. But there are costs. There are huge costs in terms of the American-Israel relationship. There are costs in terms of the everyday, there ought to be discussions about extending sovereignty into Judea and Samaria, what the Biden administration calls the West Bank. By the way, that's a fictitious label. That doesn't mean anything in today's world at all. The West Bank of the Jordan is only meaningful with the bizarre idea that Jordan was controlling that territory after the 48 war. But there are real opportunity costs to, and I'll just mention two of them, the things, the aid to the Palestinian Authority, which was stopped by President Trump, is now a thing again. And there's all kinds of ways, humanitarian and others, that they're getting around the prohibition on aid to the PA, even while the PA is still funding, they're paying terrorists to murder Jews. When they murder a Jew, or an American for that matter, either the terrorist himself, if he survives, or his family is giving money, and it's a sliding scale based on the more horrible the crime is, the murder, the more money the terrorist actually gets, or his family. So the other thing I just wanted to mention is the Biden administration says that opening a consulate in Jerusalem is not a dead issue, even though it would require a change of U.S. law. And they also want to open up the PLO embassy in Washington and have the Palestinian Arab flag flying in Washington, even though, again, that would not be allowed under existing law. But those are things the Biden administration still says they're going to move ahead with.
Absolutely. Earlier, Dan, you mentioned China and Saudi Arabia, and I wonder, obviously, this administration has no policy, foreign policy to begin with, and so you see now a lot of our adversaries making inroads in the Middle East with Saudi Arabia. So Israel now with its allies, how does Israel navigate that with an administration, a U.S. administration that's not behind it, that doesn't have its best interests? What does that look like?
I can go first this time.
Sure. Yeah.
I'll go first, and I'll just quickly say, Israel is very aware of the concerns of the United States about this. I'm a former naval officer, so I keep track of military industrial things. The Chinese would love to have relationship with Israel technology. They view it as a way kind of to get around American sanctions in some cases. And it can be very lucrative. And other countries in the world are doing this. The Germans, for example, have extensive relations with China. And Israel is very cognizant of what the limits are in those things. And I think Israel is doing better at understanding America's red lines here. There was an issue with the port in Haifa, which was going to be under the control of a Chinese company, and Israel has taken steps to isolate China from anything that could possibly be. But this is going to be an ongoing issue. After all, Israel is a sovereign country who wants to do what's best for their own people, and China is a real presence in the world. But China's closeness to Iran and Russia is something that constrains what Israel would want to do anyway. They have their own national security to worry about. If Iran is giving drones to Russia and China is assisting them in developing drone technology, Israel needs to be cognizant that they could actually provide a path that would work against their own national security interests if they're not careful. Caroline?
I think, the question of China and many, many other questions just go back to one question, which is Iran. I think, Iran, the regime has basically mortgaged off the next 25 years of its life to China. They signed some sort of a strategic economic and military cooperation deal with China a year and a half ago that integrate Iran into the Belt and Road Initiative and gives China a lot of rights to Iranian territory. And I think, China is, if we just leave China aside for 1 second and focus on Iran, when you talk about Iran selling offensive weapons to Russia, or Russia now is considering and may well have agreed to sell advanced fighter jets to Iran, because, thanks to the Obama administration, the UN embargo on weapon sales to Iran expired, I think, a year ago. So, you're looking at a question really about how long is this regime going to survive? And I think that the first thing that an incoming Netanyahu administration is going to have to do is work quietly behind the scenes to help the Iranian revolutionaries on the streets receive whatever support they need in terms of communications and other things so that they'll be better able to overthrow the regime and to speak out on behalf of regime change in Iran. I think we're seeing on the streets of Iran the first time ever since 1979 anyway, a real opportunity to overthrow this regime. And if that happens, a lot of different things are going to happen in the Middle East that are going to be beneficial for all the nations of the Middle East, first and foremost for Iran, for the Iranian people, but also for Israel and for the Gulf states and the Sunni Arab world, and also for the United States and for Europe that are also threatened by the Iranian regime. So I think that the first focus has to be that. And insofar as China is concerned, China made a big bet with the Iranian regime, just like it's making bets with Russia, that they will be part of a sphere of influence of China in the region. The Saudis understand that, and the Israelis understand that. They also understand that with the United States walking away from the region, and China making a play for the region, and the United States turning against them, turning against its allies in the international arena, whether at the UN or in the court of opinion internationally and domestically in the United States, that they have to survive in a very difficult world. And that's why you're seeing the Saudis going to bat to try to expand their ties with China. And Israel is pro-American even when America is anti-Israel. And Israel is not interested in replacing the United States with China. It is interested with having good relations with China and with having profitable relations with China to the extent that it's possible. But I think that over the past several years, both due to America's concerns, but also to Israel's own concerns about our intellectual and industrial property, you see much less excitement over the possibility of doing all sorts of ventures with Israel. Our largest food company in Israel was sold to China several years ago, and just recently it's come under an enormous amount of scrutiny domestically because of their price gouging and their lack of consideration for the public good in Israel. The now Chinese-owned Tenuva dairy cooperative food organization or food company in Israel, which is a very, very large conglomerate here in Israel. And so as Israelis begin to understand what it means for China to take over our industries, we become much less interested in having this continue. So I think that it's not only due to American pressure, but just as Americans started to understand the price of the deal that their industries made with the Chinese in earlier years, now Israelis are coming to understand the price of doing business with China for our well-being as a society. So I think that with or without American pressure, Israel is not as interested in close business relations, technology relations, industrial relations with China as we were in previous years. And I think that we were never particularly interested in having military ties with China, and we don't have them now either.
Right. No, absolutely. I think that's well stated. And I think, just to paraphrase from earlier, I think certainly the Trump administration worked very much behind the scenes to help Israel kind of come to a common perception of China that protects both American and Israeli interests. And certainly the bottom line is that American leadership and engagement is just completely missing in all of this, as adversaries try to, pursue their agendas in the region.
One of the things that I find sort of weird about China and America is that China really is good at doing infrastructure building, but so is the United States. And it strikes me as odd that the administration, whether it's Democrat or Republican, isn't giving an impetus to American industries and American infrastructure companies to take on contracts like the Haifa port or the railway from the heavy rail from Eilat to Ashdod here in Israel, and similar projects in other allied countries, and just leaving it open for China. There's no reason why American companies shouldn't be bidding in those tenders as well. And I think that, that would be something for American industrialists to be considering moving forward, that right now, for various reasons that I don't really understand, China sort of has that to itself. And it doesn't have American competitors in the international arena for infrastructure building. And it's a real shame, because I think that countries around the world would be much happier to be working with American contractors and industrialists in building their national infrastructures than with the Chinese.
Yeah. No, I think it's an excellent point. I know from colleagues it was a top priority of the Trump administration, especially through the Development Finance Corporation, and not just American companies, but also, it's not complete offshoring, but strategic decoupling of certain industries or nearshoring. But I mean, the bottom line is that there was a strategy, a vision for how to make China less compelling. And obviously, my understanding is a lot of that is kind of in autopilot or non-existent currently. Yeah. But I think it's a very well-placed point. We have, I see, 5 minutes left. I wonder if I could turn to both of you just to offer closing remarks in any aspect of the topic. Yeah.
Sure, let me go first. Yeah, very quickly, the one thing I didn't get a chance to speak about that I wanted to was about the Squad. People may know in 2019, there were 4 members of the Squad. They were the most anti-Israel presence in the House of Representatives. What you may not know is that Squad grew to 6 members in the 2020 election, and now with the 4 extreme left radicals that were voted in this time, the total number of members in the squad is 10 members of the squad now. Now, that's not to say that many Democrats are still pro-Israel, but the difference between the parties is extreme. Republicans are reflexively pro-Israel. It's hard to find one who isn't. And therefore, there's a partisan divide. ZOA is nonpartisan, and I wanted to make that clear, but most of our fight, there's 1 or 2 members of the Republican Party or fringe figures who we have to worry about, and we do. We speak up when Republicans are anti-Israel or anti-Semitic, but there's a whole group of them in the Democratic Party. In addition to those 10 members of the squad, you have another 10 or 15 members of the Democratic caucus in the House who are willing to support anti-Israel resolutions, and this is becoming a real factor in Democratic politics. So that's something I wanted to point out. It's something that we're constantly fighting against, but we need help from everyone to bring attention.
Great point. Excellent. Caroline?
I just want to say a couple things. First of all, just to go into what Dan was talking about, I think one of the things that really distinguishes the ZOA as a Jewish organization is that it really isn't a partisan organization, that in the sense that it views itself as a Jewish organization, and a Jewish organization that is concerned with Israel's ties with the United States and also with the American Jewish community, and with fighting anti-Semitism. And so whether it comes from the left or from the right, ZOA is always willing to condemn it with equal fervor. And that's really been the policy of Israel as well, that, Israel is a Jewish state. We're a nation state. We have our national interests, but we're also concerned with the situation of Jews throughout the world. And so when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism in the United States, Israel has not fallen and will not fall into the trap that many American Jewish organizations have, that involves, confusing partisan leanings with the need to fight anti-Semitism and anti-Semites wherever you find them. And so I think that is true. We are facing a situation where a significant constituency inside of the Democratic Party really is both anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. And that provides a challenge for Israel. And as a nation state, Israel has to do what it has to do to ensure its survival. But as an ally of the United States, I think we have a vested interest in the success of those who are fighting anti-Semitism, both on the right and on the left, and we'll do anything we can to support them. Very, very thankful to the Trump administration, to all of its members who really were so extraordinary in recognizing the importance of the U.S. alliance with Israel for the United States as well as for Israel, and for recognizing that it is in the United States' interest for Israel to be powerful and to be capable of defending itself by itself against all of its enemies, and for recognizing as well that Israel's enemies are also enemies of the United States, and that it's not nothing that they hate Israel and call for death to America in the same voice. At any rate, I think that those repeated calls from my son, who's on a camping trip in the Negev, probably telling me that I got to go. But I really appreciate everything that you guys are doing. And I, again, apologize for getting the hour wrong and joining belatedly. But thank you very much for doing this and having me.
Thank you. That was
I'd
very
like to thank you too, Jacob.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Dan. No, thank you both for your eloquent words, and thank you for your time and sharing your insights with us, Caroline and Dan. So thank you to you, our viewers, as well, for your time and for listening in. If you've enjoyed what you've listened to and watched, you may see more of our work, as well as the work of our partner centers, about 22 centers at the America First Policy Institute. Our website is americafirstpolicy.com. That's americafirstpolicy.com. Thank you all, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Goodbye.